Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Marina Chow, one of the curators here at CPW, and you are at Meet the Artist. It's our weekly series of artist talks, takes place here nearly every Thursday evening. And I just want to say Meet the Artist is made possible by a generous grant from the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation. Before I introduced Corinne, I want to make a few announcements, a couple of housekeeping things. If you get our newsletter, maybe you've checked your email already. If you haven't, we've announced an open call that inaugurates our new community gallery in CBW's new homes, opening in January 18th at 25 Diedrich. So if you are interested in contributing to the open call and you want to print your prints here at the Digital Media Lab, I would just say, please do so. We'd love to help you do that. But also keep an eye on the schedule on cpw.org because we are moving. So the Digital Media Lab will close in mid-December. We're finalizing that date, but we're sort of rehousing everything in our new home. And so we won't be open past mid-December. Another thing about the end of the year, if you're considering, or if you know anybody who's considering making an end of the year donation to CBW, that should also kind of happen before all the wheels get moving and we're moving to the other side. All right, so without further ado, why you're here tonight, we're very happy to have Corinne Botz. She's a photographic artist, filmmaker, and educator based in Catskill, New York. Botz's projects have explored gender, trauma, invisibility, motherhood, and romantic and dystopian notions of the domestic realm. In a feature story for the New York Times, Penelope Green wrote of her work that it reads like a DSM of contemporary American life and the dark side of domesticity. Her published books combining photography and writing include The Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death and Haunted Houses, both from Leiden, and Milk Factory, which is a forthcoming book from St. Lucie Press. Botz's photographs have been internationally exhibited at institutions such as the Brooklyn Museum, De Appel, Snack Melon, Alice Austin House, and Ben Ruby Gallery. Her Oscar-qualifying short film, Bedside Manor, in 2016, won the Grand Jury Prize at Doc NYC. And her work has been written about in numerous publications, including the aforementioned New York Times, The New Yorker, Film Magazine, Hyperallergic, and the Book Forum. She is a recipient of both the New York Foundation for the Arts and a Jerome Foundation grant. And Botz teaches at the International Center of Photography and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So please join me in welcoming Corinne Botz.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks so much for having me tonight and for coming out, everyone. So since I've moved upstate, this has been an important community for me. I love these talks, so it's great to be here. Also, CPW kind of goes back to my origins in photography. When I was in high school, it was on my radar, and I was looking at all the courses, and there was one with Sylvia Plocki, who I was admired, and I called up and I said, I can't really afford this, but do you think there might be a discount if it doesn't fill up? I'm a high school student. So they did let me into the class, and at the time, I was very serious about photography, since high school. I set up a darkroom in my neighbor's basement because their parents weren't using their darkroom equipment. And I also had this deep interest in Diane Arbus. And Amy Arbus ended up taking the workshop, and she photographed me. So my mind was like blown. And I ended up working for Sylvia Plocki. I would take the train from New Jersey to Queens and stay with her on the weekends and print with her and assist her. And years later, I also had some work in the CPW in Woodstock. So anyhow, it's especially nice to be here tonight. And let's see. So I'm going to show you work from 4 series. And these are The Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death, which is very early work, but it is the 20th anniversary of that book, so it feels appropriate to be sharing it tonight. I also have 2 large-scale images from that series on show in Woodstock at the Birdcliff Guild. It's open just through this weekend. It's called The Doll Show, so check it out if that's up your alley. I'll be showing work from Haunted Houses, my other book, Milk Factory, which is my forthcoming book. And then I felt like, in the spirit of things, to also show some work that I'm sort of like more secretive about, that's ongoing, that's less resolved. So I will also be showing you some more recent work. So this is a very formative project, and I found out about these miniature crime scene models when I was an undergrad. So really, like, I think it's 27 years ago, which is insane. I spent 7 years of my head in these dollhouses, and I will be forever changed from that and grateful to these miniature crime scene dioramas. So I was living in Baltimore, and I was interested in crime scene photography and dollhouses, and I ended up meeting a prosecutor through a project who had hundreds of dollhouses, but she didn't have any dolls in her dollhouses. And she said this was because she created perfect worlds, and she saw murder and rape and child abuse every day in her professional life, so she didn't want any dolls in the dollhouses. And I said, well, it's interesting because I'm also interested in crime scene photography. So she told me to go to the medical examiner's office, which is the morgue in Baltimore. And I went, and these disparate interests of mine in gendered space, dollhouses, and crime scenes came together in this completely unexpected way. So these were made in the 1940s and 50s after actual homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. And they were made for the purpose of training detectives. They were made by a woman named Frances Glessner Lee. She lived from 1878 to 1962. And she started the first department of legal medicine in the country at Harvard University. And oftentimes, the state troopers, the first to arrive at a crime scene, and their ability to assess and preserve visual evidence is key to solving this crime. So she had a special interest in training them. And because of time constraints and legal reasons where you couldn't bring someone to a crime scene, she came up with this idea of making these miniatures. So I began obsessively photographing the models, researching her life, and I wanted to honor her work. So from actually day one, I wanted to publish a book. It was always the goal because the models themselves are pretty inaccessible to the public. So I wanted to introduce her work to a more general audience. And I felt like as a woman, her story was underrepresented and she was sort of erased from the history books. No one knew about her. And that was very important to me. I thought of her as like my collaborator. And I wanted to sort of unearth and tell her story. So that's me at the time, just to give you a sense of scale. And when I began this project, I was living in Baltimore in a dangerous neighborhood. A number of sexual assaults and rapes had recently occurred, and I was definitely aware of my own body and space in a different way than I ever had been. And I identified with the models to a certain extent. I thought very much about the perspective of the victim and their family member. So with the assistance of a carpenter, Lee created about 3 a year. Her carpenter, who I tracked down and interviewed, equated it to the length of time that it would take to build a real house. It's a scale of 1 inch to a foot, and there's an astounding level of detail and precision. So in this one, well, first of all, there's always like a calendar, so it's frozen in time even more, pinpointed in time. In this one, spent all this time making the model and then took a blowtorch to show where the fire started. Pencils write, whistles blow, the dolls wear underwear. Sometimes there's things invisible to the eye, like a mouse in a wall. So I really wanted to bring the models to life. As objects, they felt very static, And I immediately thought how compelling they would be to reanimate photographically. So I made a lot of very deliberate decisions. For instance, I avoided showing the edge of the rooms so that as a viewer, you felt like you were entering the space. The models are kind of theatrical. Everything's on display, but I was more interested in this cinematic gaze to make it feel as if you were moving through the space. And, their cultural history has so much to do with like this more systematic control of looking. And I wanted to kind of disrupt that. And instead of photographing in black and white in a thorough manner, I was interested in using color and to me bring this sort of sense of intimacy and grace to the crime scene. So I used a large format film camera that gave me the ability to make really large scale prints, which is something I also wanted to do from the beginning. And I thought a lot about playing with a dollhouse when I was little, and that sense of absorption that you can feel where you kind of lose your sense of time and space and you can experience the large in something small. And so I wanted to kind of recreate that to an extent. So I used my own lighting, but I also took advantage of like the lighting within the models and actually within the room itself that I was shooting in. And like Lee, I wanted to kind of counterbalance this ghastly content with a sense of like comfort, which is something I try to do through the lighting, sort of enticing people in to look. And I think that is one of the reasons why people are so drawn to these, because we have this interest in crime, but it's like in a way that it like draws you in at the same time, right? I don't know if that makes sense. But so the room is obviously a very tight space that I was photographing in, but again, I'm photographing with a large format camera and selectively focusing. When you're shooting with a 4x5, you can see like exactly what's in focus. I love this one. It says, if you can see that, Hollywood's most beautiful models photographed. So as a viewer, you're asked to consider everything as potentially relevant to the crime. And you don't really know what detail is important, right? So it almost is as if every single object takes on this heightened significance. And for me, like creating this context around how you're looking at something, I've also done that in other projects like haunted houses. And really, there are solutions that are kind of kept under lock and key, but also some of them don't have solutions and you can't solve them just by looking at them. And everything happened, but they're all composites. So nothing happened exactly how you're seeing it. So this is a hat. It kind of has a more oblique relationship to violence. And even with historic crime scene photography, I am interested not just like in the crime itself, but also just in the banality of the violence, in the way that you can get a sense of how people live during certain time periods through these images. So this image points to Lee's incredible detail work. She knit these with needles the size of straight pins using a magnifying glass. And her eyes would fatigue probably after like a minute. She described this as such a chore and such a bore. But I like to think that there's this sense of lavishing love on these like brutal scenes. So what I noticed from the start, and as I said at the time, nothing was really written about the models, very little information was available, but I noticed this predominance of female victims. So out of the 18 models on display at the medical examiner's office, 12 were women victims. And there was also this gender notion of space where the men were killed in these more like masculine parts of the house, like in the garage, in the barn, in the saloon and jail, and the women were killed in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the bathroom. And I wondered if Lee, on some level, was commemorating these female victims. I did not come across any evidence to support that. At the same time, I feel like she's making these deaths visible, so she's asking us to take them seriously. And this is probably reflective of the cases that she came across. And, in the United States, women are much more likely to be killed by a loved one or a partner than they are by a stranger. And that's the case for these as well. So, it's very dangerous to be a woman on a certain level. And I think she was not a feminist, but I feel like they are feminist in the sense that she's revealing the violence that is oftentimes originates and is enacted within the domestic, and these women are all sort of entrapped within these domestic spaces where they've met their deaths. So from the start, they just feel so contemporary to me and subversive, and I feel like there's so much we can still learn from them. So there's something childlike about the fact that they're in like what we think about as dollhouses or as like dollhouse furniture that's sometimes modified in the cases. And of course, dollhouses we associate with children and with the socialization of women, but she also throws it out the window, and like you can't play with these, you can't move anything around, everything's in a particular place. And of course, she would never describe them as a dollhouse because dollhouses are associated with women and children, two marginalized groups, and she wanted to be taken seriously by the police officers, so she called them miniatures. And at the same time, I love the historic images that show these kind of burly policemen hovering over these delicate dollhouse-like creations. So I was interested in the models from a lot of different angles. I think forensics is fascinating, but it was really Frances Glessner Lee whose story I was most interested in from the start. I felt like they were these overdetermined objects, as if she was haunting them. And again, I was thinking about this like artistic legacy, and I thought of her as this collaborator. And I thought, like, why did she make these slightly mad models? I know they were for training purposes, but what else isn't here? So telling her story as this unsung pioneer became really the, primary part of the work. So I took the majority of pictures, graduated from school at the Maryland Art Institute, and then I began the second component of the project, which was doing a lot of research, interviews. I tracked down her carpenter. I interviewed her daughter-in-law, who was in her 90s at the time. All these old-time police officers that worked with her who have since passed away, all of her grandchildren, some of her great-grandchildren. I did archival research at the Glessner House Museum in Chicago, the Rocks Estate in New Hampshire, which was her summer home growing up, and then her full-time residence later on. And I felt like a detective, I really did. And, I could not have found a more interesting subject. Here she is, surrounded by all these men. So it gives you a sense of the time period. This was the 10th seminar in homicide investigation at the Harvard Medical School. The only other woman in it is her daughter. So I'll just give you a little background. I oftentimes do just like 1 hour lectures just on this project. So she was homeschooled until she was 17 years old. She had by private tutors in the house, and she had an exceptional education. And although she wanted to study medicine, she's been quoted saying that her father wouldn't let her because she was a lady. Some people refute that. Some people say, maybe she told that story, maybe it's not true. The Glessner House Museum does not like that narrative. But in any case, she did not go to college, and she really resented that fact throughout her life, that she did not have any letters after her name. And she did follow the much more prescribed life of an upper-class woman at that time. She married very young. She had 3 children, and her marriage was just not a good match from the start, but it took years before her husband would grant her a divorce, even though they had lived separately. And she had a very conflicted relationship with her parents. Really, domestic life never suited her, and it wasn't until very late in life, after her parents died and she came into her inheritance, that she was free to pursue this long-held interest in legal medicine. And her daughter-in-law said she didn't even begin to live until her 60s. And her son said that he thought his mother should have been born a man at liberty to pursue a profession. And I really love how late in life she was able to sort of redefine and find happiness through making these models, and sort of was able to have a voice that way. So I thought a lot about issues of domestic space and how her upbringing informed the models that she made. This is the Glessner House Museum in Chicago. If you're ever in Chicago, I highly recommend going there. It was built by the eminent Henry Hobson Richardson. And it's supposed to be haunted by her parents. So this is the only picture that's in both of my books. And her parents were very interested in the arts and craft movement, this idea of this return to this pre-industrial object, handcrafted, one-of-a-kind objects. They also thought about every single element of design and textile within the room. Her father wrote a book about their house called The Story of a House. And they wanted to create a very moral and like cultured environment for their children to grow up in. So the nutshells can be thought of as sort of a continuation, but also a perversion of this in terms of, one, making these handcrafted objects. But with the nutshells, we see both romantic and dystopian ideas of the home at play. So again, I wanted from the start to publish a book. There were many dark days where I thought it would never see the light of day. And, again, why I wanted to publish a book is I wanted to introduce her work to a wider public. And I wrote a lengthy essay in the book, about her life, gendered space, sort of through a feminist lens. And I also love the book format, in addition to the fact that there's always this research that underlines my work. I also love the book format because to me, it's like very intimate, and it's almost like a house that you open that you can enter. So this is a miniature painting of the house that Lee lived in when she made the models in New Hampshire. So when I was going to do research there, I was like going down the road and I was like, oh my God, I've seen that house before. And it's always fascinated me how she included these autobiographical elements in it. So they were factually accurate in terms of the scene of the crime and the body, how long it's been decomposing, the color of the skin, the blood splatter, the angle of the blood splatter. That's all accurate. But at the same time, she did have fun when she made them, and she included these personal elements. I asked her carpenter, and he thought it was because she was so proud of her house. So it's almost like above, the symbolic place above the mantle, as if it's the ideal that the family didn't live up to. But in any case, the way that she combined fact and fiction and her own imagination and took artistic license when she made them is something that has always interested me. And I would say in my own work, I also do that as well, in the sense of there might be a documentary starting point, but fiction comes into the work all the time. And I also allow myself to sort of bring my own subjectivity into the work that I'm making. So this is Red Bedroom. This is a prostitute, and the whole entire rest of the house is red. Her boyfriend / client is Mr. Green, the opposite of red. So she loves Sherlock Holmes, and you feel like there is this almost literary devices and thinking about the interior and how the interior tells a story. And that's something that I love to think about when I'm reading novels, and when I'm looking at these as well. In this case, 3-room dwelling. The pink and the blue are like very clearly delineated. So she's now, she's known as the mother of forensic science, and really has been written into a lot of history books, has gotten a lot of more recognition in recent years. So it's really brought me great happiness to see that nutshells gain the audience that they deserve and have played a role in that. So when my book came out, I had a solo exhibition at Bellwether Gallery in New York City. These are darkroom prints that I made, 40 by 50 and 30 by 40. So different sense of editing than within the book format. I'm thinking more about the more iconic images and narratives between the images. These sort of vignettes. Okay, so haunted houses. So this is another long-term project. It's a survey of sites throughout the United States where ghosts are reported. And I was interested in this connection between ghosts and houses. A lot of time people think that the ghost is haunting their house because they died there or they loved it so much or they built the house. But of course, ghosts are also sort of a favorite motif in film or literature because they also disrupt this notion of the private and secure home and the sort of boundaries of a home. So I wasn't looking to prove or disprove ghosts, but I was interested in the relationship between ghosts and houses, specifically domestic spaces. And to me, it felt so fertile because it's sort of what I feel when I'm in a space to begin with. Like, I think of a space as this living organism that's not an inert object. And I think that these like layers of history and emotion can reside in spaces or can be embedded in them. This was taken in Lilydale, New York, a town of mediums. It's a very strange seance that I attended. So I photographed in some legendary houses, but I was most interested in photographing private residences and meeting otherwise ordinary people who believed they had ghosts in their houses. So I pretty much rarely, if ever, had permission to photograph. I would research a site. I would just show up on the doorstep with my large format camera, and I would ask if I could come in and take a photograph of their house. And pretty much everyone welcomed me inside, and they shared their stories. And I had a little audio recorder where I recorded firsthand testimonies of ghostly experiences. This is in Harlan, Kentucky. So I would try to open myself up to the invisible nuances of the space when photographing. And I think of it as listening to the space or being at the mercy of the space. So it's a lot to take in when you're just in a brand new space and you're kind of like, oh, it looks just like any other house, this haunted house. What am I going to take a picture of? So for me, the 4x5 camera, I couldn't have done this project if I was shooting digital. If I was shooting digital, I probably would think, oh, nothing looks I don't know what to photograph. Let me just like take a million pictures and see if something sticks, right? And I could never have done the editing. But instead, I would just take 2, maybe 3 pictures of each space. The large format camera, it's sort of a meditative process. It really like grounded me in that space. And I would take, I'd think of the pictures as this like souvenir of a small thing that I took away with me. So that camera really helped shape the project. Again, I wanted to respond to the interior rather than add something to it or change it. This is an army barrack in the Pacific Northwest. So this project was inspired by women writers like Edith Wharton. Sorry, I'm like blanking right now. Willa Cather, Toni Morrison. There's a whole bunch of Victorian writers in particular, and a lot of anthologies out there where they write these ghost stories as a way to articulate domestic discontents, sexual politics, mothering, things that they maybe couldn't talk about or say directly in polite society. So that was the main inspiration. And of course, I was also interested in historic spirit photographs that were used to prove attempt to prove the existence of the afterlife. And there was also this tradition of women being these mediums. So I thought of myself as continuing this tradition when I went to photograph in the houses. Now, of course, I was not trying to capture ghosts on film, but the interesting thing is, everyone brings their own history when they look at pictures. And if someone's interested in spirit photography, they will tell me that there's like ghosts, and they'll tell me about all the ghosts in my pictures. So there's a whole nother way you can look at them. So this image ties into this Victorian sensibility that is mentioned. This is in Staten Island. The story here goes that this woman committed suicide after her husband died in the Civil War, and she haunts the house. This is a fragment of a painting of her, and apparently she got so mad that she burned the painting one night. So with this picture, you also literally see the layers within the space, the wallpaper underneath. And I was also just looking at the symbolism of the interior when I'm photographing. This one's supposed to be like a lot darker. It looks too bright on the screen, but I don't know what that line was for, but to me, it could be like symbolic of a cusp between worlds, like afterlife. So a window, the bright light to the dark room, if a door is open, if a door is closed, all those different things I'm sort of attuned to when I'm looking at this space. This is the Edgar Allan Poe's bedroom in Baltimore, or the entrance to it. So I'm going to play you a few excerpts from ghost stories. I made a vinyl record from the ghost stories. So in exhibitions, there's a communal listening experience. And so I'll just give you a little background. This, by the way, is in Skowhegan, Maine. When I was at Skowhegan, the residency, I didn't even want to work on this project, but for some reason, I just kept hearing about ghost stories every time I left this Skowhegan to go to the diner in town. So I ended up photographing, I think, 5 places there. So houses collect impressions of past residents, whether subtle energy left by them, the knowledge of a violent event that occurred there, or the materialization of a ghost. When people move into houses, they commonly try to make it their own by cleaning, renovating it, burning sage, or getting a priest's blessing. In the next house that I'll show you, I think the audio will play when I click to it, but that's in Harlan, Kentucky, or in Cumberland, Kentucky. No one outside the family has ever lived in the house, and the grandmother built it, and she haunts the house. So they're always negotiating space because the son-in-law didn't get along with his mother-in-law. So he asked her to stay downstairs when he stays upstairs. And when I was there photographing, the little girl got off the bus, and I recorded her story about seeing her grandmother.
One time when I was sitting on the top bunk and I was sitting down, I was praying to the Lord and stuff and talking to him. And then I saw my granny walk in the door and she scared me. And I had to go down to Mommy and I cried and I couldn't go to sleep. She was more prettier. She had short hair about up right here, and they're all curls. And she dyed her hair brown.
So she also goes on to talk about this Barbie car that the grandma gave her. Even though there's no batteries in it, it apparently goes around by itself. It even has gone out the door and down the street. So this is a family in Girard, Pennsylvania, and they lived there for over 40 years. I had pancakes at their house with them. Before they moved in, they knew that this elderly brother and sister were murdered in the kitchen. And when they lived there, there was a lot of different strange things that happened. One of their kids saw the ghost. Once there was the entire contents of a room, apparently, just flew around like there was a tornado, but just one room. And then the one daughter said she took the ghost with her because she liked her the best. So they also, an ongoing theme is there might be something scary that happens, but most people end up sort of coming to terms with their ghost and liking their ghost a lot. But in any case, it wasn't until living in the house for over 20 years that some townsperson came across the murder photographs and the crime scene photographs. And then they saw what happened and how horrible it was. And then they felt like the ghost energy kind of left because they came to terms with what happened in the house.
I think they protect the house. I really do. I feel that if were somebody trying to break in, that they would scare the pants off them. And surprisingly enough, none of it ever felt uncomfortable or unsettling. It was more of a comfort, which is why I used to tell people it was more like there were caretakers in the house. It's sometimes when you go to bed at night and your husband's away, and the house all of a sudden seems a little bit creepier and a little bit. You never felt that here.
This is in Maine, just a stone throw from my aunt's house. I'm standing in the gas station. I know it was uninhabited, but the gas station person had the keys. So that was a house I got to really take a lot of pictures of. But people recognize it because this, looks like the most archetypal haunted house.
They lived in the
Hold on, let me just go back. All right, so one of my favorite people I spoke with was an Episcopalian minister named Charles, and he was based in Irvington on the Hudson. And him, his wife, and a lot of people from their congregation experienced this ghost of the past people that lived there, the past minister. But in any case, I love talking to him because he has more of a spiritual framework for understanding the haunting.
And they lived in the rectory so long. Not surprising. People wonder why she would come back, and there are lots of theories that I don't buy any of it, that people are stuck and they can't move on. I think that's utter nonsense. That's a projection. I think that whatever reasons, they drop in for a visit. I have no idea why. And if reality is reality and there's only one reality, why not? Heaven breaks into this realm all the time, and why should we be surprised that somebody appears?
I think I kind of believe that more than anything else that I heard. You know what I mean? That makes sense to me. Just that time is not so linear. So on a personal level, I worked on this project on and off. I also worked on another project that I'm not sharing tonight, but it was my thesis at Bard College, images of the homes of people with agoraphobia who are homebound in their spaces. So I oftentimes have a few ongoing projects, but worked on this project all through my 20s. I think part of it was visiting houses, seeing these interiors, thinking about what kind of house I would like to have one day maybe, but also I had a very idyllic childhood, but I think there's this cultural history of space, especially in terms of feminism and this disenfranchisement of women, this false division between public and private space. And so I think I was also trying to come to terms with that as well, and these sort of nebulous questions that I had about domestic space while I was photographing. So kind of reclaiming domestic space to an extent. Another house where there's this crazy murder that took place in New Jersey, but that's what I photographed. This is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I think of the house as a stage where, our lives sort of play out. So this felt apropos. And so again, I took a lot of pictures. I photographed in over 100 haunted houses around the country. So one is I wanted to get this collective sense. There's different regional ghost stories, but I was also interested in, different notions of interiority. And I was also thinking of the road trip. So a lot of times these were on road trips by myself, where I would I was interested in Harlan, Kentucky. So I decided to take a road trip by myself and find haunted houses while I was there. And I think about the road trip, it's almost this rite of passage for photographers, Robert Frank, Alex Soth, the list goes on, right? But they're mostly looking at public spaces. So for me, it was this twist where I was interested in collecting interior views, and I thought of myself as this flaneur of interior space. So you can see they've been exhibited in a few different ways, but oftentimes it's with at least 50 to up to 80 pictures in this grid. So you can see this idea of seriality and collection comes into play. And I did not paint the walls purple. Everyone asked that question at the end, but this is just a decision from the curators because it was in Dortmund, Germany, and the space was so enormous. It was a show about the supernatural, so it's fine with me. But yeah, I like this idea of the pictures building off one another. You could draw maybe the perfect haunted house by looking at these, but still the subject is kind of invisible in the images. But for me, it's also this invitation for the viewer to bring their own subjectivity to looking. So I think of there as three subjectivities, my very, very personal response to a space. And then there's a very personal ghost stories. And then there's the viewer and what they bring. And I think we always, bring our own subjectivity when looking at work. This is also this invitation to project into this work, right? Because of the framework that I've created. So again, I conceived that this is a book from the start. And I really love sort of reaching this wider kind of also non-art audience. There was a monk in Oregon who wrote to me for years about seeing ghosts. I definitely should have gone and done a project on him, but I didn't get there. And it was the same designer, Michael Worthington. Just like in the other book, I wrote all the text. This is called Women, Ghosts, and Houses. Starts out with an Emily Dickinson quote. And then a selection of the most interesting oral histories are transcribed. That's Alcatraz on the left. Okay, so moving on to Milk Factory. So this is my pumping space at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I thought it was very strange with all these empty shelves, and I didn't even know what a pumping room was until I had given birth and realized I had to go back to work, and I was wondering where I would pump. So like a lot of people, it's all a lot of things are just not explained before you have a kid. And so I took a picture just for myself. I mean, it was really just a record for myself of early motherhood. I thought the space was so strange. And then I didn't look at it probably till like 2 years later, maybe more. I looked at the contact sheets and I realized its relation to my other projects as an exploration of gender and space. And I thought like, well, this could be a really interesting, unconventional, sort of unromanticized view of motherhood. So I started accompanying women to the workplace. This is Ruth Hoagley, the curator of the Whitney Museum. She lost a button that day because it can happen when you're pumping. It's always, it was hard to get volunteers, but also not once I found them. They were very enthusiastic. And it was really like an honor to meet these women. It's a really intense time period right after you have a kid and you're going back to work. You have like birth experiences that you're processing. You're leaving your baby with someone else at home, and you're, thinking about your job. It's complicated. So for myself, I had this life-threatening medical stuff when I had my daughter. So I always think of this kind of as like, it was also therapeutic for me to like meet these women and to make this work. I gave each person an 8x10 photograph, and people were like super excited to have me come honor their pumping space. So I think pumping tells you a lot more about being a parent today than nursing in the strict sense, because actually this idealized image of Madonna and child of a child at a mother's breast is like really unattained, like not realistic for most women, because we don't have paid family leave in the United States. And so people go back to work very early. And there's also this intense pressure to breastfeed. To pump milk feed your child milk. And so that results in, all these lactation spaces as a Band-Aid solution to the lack of policy that we have. So I think of the photographs as being making the invisible labor visible. And the title itself, Milk Factory, emphasizes that lactation is a form of labor, even if federal law conceptualizes it as a break from work, and actually your employer is not required to compensate you for the time that you're pumping at work. And only 40% of women have access to pumping spaces at work, dedicated spaces. So without that, they'll be pumping in bathrooms or their cars or, that closet in utility closets. This is my friend Genevieve, who photographs for very blue chip art galleries, and this is at their storage space. And I just love how she just is making herself at home in the bathroom. She's like hanging up her pumping bra. She got a packing blanket from the artwork she's laying out. And then there's like a baby block, just because as a mom, you oftentimes have like just a random crap in your bag. So lactation rooms highlight this demand for productivity in the workplace, along with the cultural expectation to love and care for a child. But to me, it reflects this deeper split of the self when you have a child that like you often experience at birth, where there's this another being that exists outside of your consciousness. And as a parent, you're moving between the world of work and the world of family life, and succeeding at one oftentimes feels like you're failing at the other one. And so for me, the absence of people, the baby, and the parent and the child in these pictures, it shows how actually milk is preferred as this disembodied product in this late capitalist society that actually values productivity over health. So again, there's all these just like ideological contradictions in terms of parenthood. This is a private school. I accidentally spilt the person's milk when I was photographing it. So they're so like, the rooms are so utilitarian and they're also so emotionally charged. And you really get a sense of what people think about women by the rooms they set aside for them to pump in. And oftentimes they're completely clinical and there's no artwork and there's nothing hung up. And they're just like, very small. Actually, like what women look at when they're pumping is important. And if they're relaxed, it is important. So women are often advised to actually look at pictures of their children to help with letdown. So, I think about the power of photography. And in this case, like actually this photograph results in this like physical response, which is pretty amazing. And there's an arbitrary quality to the rooms, which I think is also reflected in the precarious position that women have when they have a child and go back to work. If you have a very high level position, it doesn't mean you necessarily have a nicer pumping space. This is someone who manages like very fancy buildings, but she has nowhere to pump when she's moving around New York City. So oftentimes the basement is where she ends up. So you've got like a rat trap over there and these two pumps and these two pumps. And then a warning about like protecting your child on this container. But you're like, what about the mother? So I'm photographing primarily with a 4x5 camera. I also bring in medium format digital camera. Sometimes if time's tight, I might have to just use that camera, but most of the time I'm using my 4x5. And I'm really interested again in this idea of honoring labor in the space. And that camera is tied to, genres of still life and interior photography. And I think elevating, extending that tradition, but also elevating it by this like formal aesthetic and approach by which is what is otherwise a very marginalized subject matter. This is at B&H Photo actually, and this is communal. They wanted more privacy, so they hung up some shower curtains, and definitely a cyborg vibe with all these hard drives and the pump and everyone things like plugged in. This is one of my favorite photos. This is someone who's a Botox injector. That's Union Square out the window. I could tell everyone in her office was scared to death of this woman. And I feel like she's sort of pumping on her own terms. She's not like subjected to this room. She's like the boss. And you're like sitting across from her at some meeting. That's sort of the feeling I had when I was taking this. And there's a gun that's facing you and these weird crystals. And then there's like the yin yang of the pumps. And then I don't know what she's drinking, but a lot of people have felt like it's a frog. But it is like the most perfectly colored breast milk I've ever seen. I will give her that. So this is my friend Mathilde Cohen. We did a collaboration together during the pandemic about lactation during COVID. She'll be writing one of the texts for my book. She teaches at UConn, and she's a legal scholar who looks a lot at food and has written many incredible academic texts about lactation. And with her first kid, she was commuting from New York City to UConn, getting there early to pump before class. And she just was like, I can't do this anymore. So she decided to use her privilege as a white cisgendered woman to publicly pump on the Amtrak train and to sort of open that conversation up. And you can tell she actually also had these bottles made that are glass because she hated the idea of putting the breast milk into plastic. So I'll read you something here. The subject of this photograph wrote to me, "The photographs represent a very personal and meaningful moment in my life that I was happy to share with you. I believe that a conversation about this is not only important, but it's also long overdue. I take pride in knowing that my pictures are part of your project. The bag was embroidered by my mom when I was in kindergarten. Flower was my nickname. I like that you picked that one because my mom passed away a year and a half ago, and her memory lives on through these objects." So I also love that she's a VP at Italy, and she has like milk and cookies there. And I understand that too. Like you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. I have to go pump before work. So I'm just going to like get myself a cookie because I have to do this thing and it'll make me feel better. Because like no one likes pumping. I don't know if I mentioned that. It's not really something that anyone likes doing. Yeah. And obviously her computer is also her tray for pouring the milk. So they're named creative director. They're named for the diverse professions of the different women. On the one hand, I felt like when I had a kid, I entered this like tribe of motherhood. At the same time, early motherhood can feel very lonely. So I think of these like individual pumping rooms as taking on this power when they're exhibited together and in conversation with each other, this sort of collective power through the accumulation. So when I exhibited these photographs, started showing them, I didn't realize like what a cultural blind spot it would be. And also how there's also this like health lesson that sometimes is involved in explaining what this is and what pumping rooms are. And that to me is kind of unique to photography. And I love that aspect of it. It's always interesting, like to see the read of work when it goes out into the world and how that might change things for you. This is at LaGuardia Airport. It's one of those little pods and women hang up notes for each other. So I'll just pause it there. This is at Julia Tutwiler prisoner in Alabama. So there's this implied separation when you're pumping between mother and child. And the separation here is like, you know, more prominent. So there's a organization where, because women are separated from their kids, their child 24 hours after giving birth in prison. And so there's an organization that comes and they take the milk and they deliver it to the child outside of prison. And the inmates decorated this whole room. It used to be a solitary confinement cell. And they even like made the artwork that's hanging up in it. This is a farm worker who pumps in a tent. So, I mean, it might seem at first like crime scene models, haunted houses, and lactation rooms, like those seem maybe different, but like I think you might be realizing how connected all these things are in my brain. And part of it has to do with like space, right? And what I spoke of before is this false separation between what's public and what's private. And women historically have been excluded from workplaces. And so their domestic labor, caretaking is not valued because it's not visible in the public sphere. And similarly, lactation rooms are designed as like these very, like the maternal body is like cloistered away behind this door. They're labeled in very gendered language. And I think the question is like, what would it look like if women were encouraged to pump or breastfeed anywhere and everywhere? So my other books I started as book projects from the beginning. Was not the case with this project. I thought of it as kind of over around the time the pandemic hit. And then Mark Alisteron of St. Lucie Books asked me a few times, like, do you want to publish a book of this? And then all of a sudden it just like clicked in my brain that yes, actually this should be a book. And I'm grateful for him for recognizing that before I did. So it's really reinvigorated and I'm super excited to add new pictures. I've been photographing upstate. I really want to add as much like plurality of pumping rooms as possible. If you know anyone who's pumping, please let me know. I'm also photographing the exteriors, and this is a recent one. This is a musician who was performing at this old church in Roxbury, New York, and she happened to be singing the song called Cruel Mother, which is this old murder ballad about a woman who has 2 illegitimate children, and she breastfeeds them and then murders them. So that was just like crazy. This was from Hudson Hall. And if you guys are familiar with Hudson Hall, I scanned this 4x5 negative last week. There are actually 3 from the shoot that I really love, so I don't know if this will make the final cut, but I did like this sort of Vanitas vibe with the flowers in it. This is a neighbor across the hall from my studio at Foreland in Catskill. I love the artist studio pumping picture. So in addition to the photographs, I made a 10-minute film, and it focuses on a lactation room in Capitol Hill. So a congressional lactation room, a House lactation room, where it's a rare bipartisan space where Democrats and Republicans pump. It's actually very unique in terms of pumping space because it's a communal pumping space. So people get to know each other from their voice, from their shoes. They like show each other baby pictures through the curtains. So it's kind of this like glimmer of hope in, it's a glimmer of hope in terms of connecting and hoping that laws will be passed to protect women and children. Nancy Pelosi put the lactation rooms in when she became Speaker of the House, and her office is like down the hall. My last film shoot was a week before the Capitol shut down from COVID. And then it was like crazy because I was editing this a year later when there was the riots and they broke into Nancy Pelosi's office and like destroyed it. So, instead of like protecting children, we see this like other vision of like chaos and terror. And this is, another side of that. So I will, and for me, it's also just so symbolic. This is where these laws are decided that, change our lives. So I will play you a clip from the 10-minute film. The entire film is available on my website if you want to watch it.
If I could afford not work, I just wouldn't work.
Right. Right? Exactly.
You don't want to sit in a pumping room 3 times a day. I actually kind of like the break.
House will come to order.
Yeah.
It's like on days when I'm not too busy, it's kind of nice to have a little reset. I had a friend who's, pumped in the closet, off-site meeting.
I had to go to a day-long meeting at this one organization, and they didn't have an extra room, or at least they said they didn't. So they said I'd have to go to the bathroom to do it. So I just like laid out paper towels everywhere. I used all their paper towels.
I mean, that's like the worst nightmare. It's like if you're stuck somewhere without a pump and without a baby.
Right. And so like it's so nice that in our workplace that they have these pumps and that a room is set aside.
Actually, most of my friends who went back to work stopped pumping as soon as they went back to work because they just didn't have time.
That has resurfaced at state. So actually, like a bunch of moms got together and like we have a nursing moms listserv, and we're like, everyone submit that we need them to pay to ship milk home. Like we all like flooded their inbox with it.
Wow.
And they started working on it. And then separately, like I had my own like one woman campaign to have them approve it before the regulations were like officially done for the whole department. And it took 3 months and they finally said yes.
Hey, way to go.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Well done.
Come home to what, right? Like we do the daycare and the aftercare, and then you just do the pickup
This
on the way
provision will
home from
provide
work. And,
12 weeks paid parental leave
I think like
for
not
all
having
federal
someone in the
employees
house
for the
and
birth of
even,
a
like,
child or adoption of a child.
extended family. That's
By
also
providing
very
this leave,
too.
studies indicate
Right,
we could
like
prevent the
moved away.
departure of over 2,600 female employees per year.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the
Every drop is like gold.
of the Space Force provision.
So yeah, you kind of enter that life world. You never leave.
If I could afford not work,
You never leave the room, and it's not really didactic. It's more like listening to conversations, and actually, so much of the conversation is like information sharing, and I don't know, just I think a form of connection that we don't necessarily see depicted in mainstream media. Installation view of a show at Baxter. It's CCNY of the work, and also some of my books in my personal collection that I put on display. In 2019, I also curated a show in the main space at Baxter about artists working with motherhood in their work, kind of in a more conceptual way, what's at stake for motherhood for the mother, rather than like pictures of children, if that makes sense. Artists in it were Alice Elizabeth Taylor, Lenka Clayton, Marina Barrio, Jamie Dimond, Patty Chang, probably forgetting someone, but okay. So some recent work. So so the series is Open House. But in 2021, I organized an exhibition in Catskill, New York at this incredible space called Fahrenheit 451 House. And I also was using that space as like my studio during the pandemic. So I asked two of my friends who I'd gone to the LMCC with like over a decade earlier to respond to the house, but we also made work kind of in conversation with one another. So it was a sculptor, Alana Herzog, and my friend, the poet, Brenda Coltis, who has a house up in Woodstock. So I did a few different projects there, but I'll just show you this one. It's called Open House. So within the show, it just looks like a kind of a found album, and there's no context given. And it's made up of photographs of interiors, and they're actually taken from 3D house tours at realtor sites. So during the pandemic, like a lot of other people, or like some people, I was looking to buy a house in this very inflated market, and I spent so much time like looking at pictures of houses for sale, wondering, could we afford this house? Could I imagine myself living there? Really like projecting into the images in this really interesting way. And also just became really fascinated by the imagery. So at a time when I couldn't actually go into a house and photograph, I started moving the camera around these 3D tours and carefully composing pictures of the interiors and creating this archive of houses that were for sale, kind of like from the pandemic to when we bought a house, but also I sort of cheat and add more sometimes. And even if you weren't looking to buy a house, there was like some New York Times article about how people were like constantly on Zillow, just sort of imagining different lives for themselves, and especially when things became completely unaffordable, escaping in this computer generated world where like everything is affordable during that experience can become even more appealing. So again, there's this like sense of confabulation where I was just projecting into these images. And I was interested in just these like everyday images of people's lives. It's kind of like the anti-Airbnb. It's like not the fancy upstate New York. It's like the houses like in our price range, but also to me, like, these people are not staging their house to be sold for the most part. I mean, it's actually very strange. People have like sometimes like laundry on the ground when the 3D house tour is being taken. So I often wondered, like, why people were moving? Did someone die? Did someone die of COVID? Were they being displaced because of gentrification? And unlike traditional real estate photography, where sometimes you can go back and like find a picture of the house that, a house that was listed, these are like these 3D tours that are really large to sort of store on the server. So right after the house sells, they're just completely deleted. And so I think of that as being like I'm almost capturing this in somewhat impermanent moment in time, analogous to like traditional photography. So from the hundreds of images from the archive, I also made a selection of like 18 images that I sort of added grain to, really spent time printing. So it's amazing how well a screenshot can actually hold up. It's mind blowing. And these are around 10 by 17. Anything bigger, they start to fall apart a bit. But yeah, I love the puzzle, this shadow. So again, this is something that's virtual that was never intended to have this physical form. And just like, I feel like it's a Wes Anderson set with this wallpaper and these odd deodorants. And also it says Betty, and that's the name of my grandmother. So I also am thinking about, again, this follow-up to a lot of artists have made work with like Street View, like Doug Rickard. And again, this sort of fits into my own interest in domestic space. I've always thought domestic space is the most powerful domain. This was sad. This is an altar for a son who died after an illness. And here we have homeschool. There's prayer and Bible at 9 before school starts. I felt so bad for this kid. Her mom was actually the principal of the school. Her desk is right across from hers in the basement. I really got to know like every inch of these houses. These were renters and a lot of really amazing home altars around their house. Some people choose to have AI blur their images. Probably a good idea because the people like me out there appropriate the work. And so I oftentimes photograph the 3D camera. And, these cameras don't really have a perspective, right? They see like everything. So I think of myself as like the ghost in the machine, kind of giving a perspective to the views, to the images. Okay, so this is a Dollhouse View. I have not presented this work before. I will start with a quote from The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, which I read at some point while working on this. How would it be if the house fell apart once their dad said the whole place ought to be condemned? Did he mean that maybe some night when they were asleep, the walls would crack and the house collapse, bury them under all the plaster and the broken glass and smashed furniture so that they could not move or breathe? So within the Realtor 3D app on the site, there's also something called Dollhouse View. So of course, I love the name. So I was also exploring that. And you can kind of like pause your screen when the 3D and the 2D come together. And there's obviously like significant digital distortion here. So walls are like kind of disintegrating, and there's just like a strong sort of quality of dislocation and chaos that I was interested in. So after I take the overall encompassing picture, then I zoom into the space and I take tons of like screenshots of details that I stitch back in, oftentimes using the pen tool for precision. And then sometimes I also will play with mirroring some sort of like glitches where there's no information to play around with the foreground and the background. So there's very like traditional perspective is kind of thrown out the window and abandoned here. And I'm really interested in just this new way of looking at space that is available through this technology. And again, like the way that our own experience of space is like we're living this metaverse. A lot of times we're not experiencing space in person. It's through this virtual image. So for me, there's a sense of like entropy, but also there's this richness of like family histories and these lives that have been lived in these houses. So I always am interested in getting the most high resolution screenshot and putting that in whenever there's a photograph. So pointing to this indexical nature of photography. And again, just the strangeness of these like personal lives made public through real estate photography. So each image is named for the geographic location that it's located. So this is Woodcrest Drive. I was thinking about maybe including the selling price of the house in parentheses to talk about that commodification. So yeah, it's very addictive making these. I'm really someone who likes the real world. Actually, like, even though people are not in my pictures, all my work is about relationships and people and that I meet through my work. But I also like cannot stop making these pictures, trying to figure something out. I mean, it's a big shift formally from the 4x5 camera, clearly, but at the same time, this idea of domestic disturbance, this idea of memory within the house, displacement, space, the connection between space and identity, or like inner and outer worlds, is also kind of consistent. At the same time, there's this idea of like commodification of the home, which is new and interesting to bring into the conversation. I mean, I think it's funny as well. Like people from real estate market would be like, looks like I'm just like making a nightmare of the house they're trying to sell. And it's hard to tell, like, is the house falling apart, or is that just that moment and how it looks in the picture? So you can see I'm interested in this like density of details, this maximalist space. Again, overdetermined with life. Like I'm always blown away with just like we moved into our house 2 years ago and it just like filled up so quickly. And how did we live in like a 2-bedroom apartment in New York for like so many years before that? So just like I just feel overwhelmed by all the stuff that we accumulate. And I grew up in a house with a lot of stuff. I was on Good Morning America in high school for having a messy room with my sister. So this is also just part of my psyche, I think. And I often am thinking about just this idea, I don't know, this metaphysical way about like destruction and creation and how they often go hand in hand. I love this one where the outside is like coming in and you see this like little, so the 3D camera is always in there somewhere. So here it is reflected, a detail of it reflected in the window. And I don't know why it took me so long to find this perspective underneath where everything's like floating. So I felt like super productive and inspired. I've done like actually so many projects in the past 4 years. This is just like a small fragment. But I wanted to show you one more. This is called Unforgotten Names. And it's names engraved in houses. Well, this is actually at Foreland, where I have my studio. So again, thinking about these ideas of ownership and claiming of space, but also this relationship between oneself and the home. So it's kind of this domestic graffiti. And also I think this idea of like not wanting to be forgotten, putting your name in a house. So again, I like a lot of detail. Normally it's through the 4x5 camera, which I'm using here. So after I get a scan, I love like just working in, like bringing out the shadows, bringing more detail that I did not see when I was there. I think of it as very physical and bodily, but actually the real estate stuff, since I'm taking so many screenshots, I also feel like it's this weird medical imaging where I'm zooming in and taking these pictures. That's Sally. So I'd love to show these as sculptural objects within relationship to each other, playing with a trompe l'oeil. This is in one of my best friend's attics. I'm mostly in attics and basements, so it's sort of this domestic archaeology. And that's Bertha. There's also, my other friend also has Bertha in her attic, so it was obviously a very popular name at a certain moment. So as you've probably realized, I use my camera kind of as this license, as an excuse maybe to get access to people's houses. So now it's my invitation to you. If you have any names in your houses, please invite me over and I will come take a picture. And that's it. Yeah, I'd be happy to take questions if you guys have any.
Comment?
Yeah.
That work on lactation
Yeah.
in the film should, in this country, be required viewing for all men. And from my particular perspective of having dated a doctor off and on for about 10 years in Canada,
and
spent a lot of time there.
Yeah.
And it just brings to light that this country spends more money per capita on healthcare than in Canada. If you're an assistant, if you get pregnant, you get a year off at 65% pay, and your job guaranteed when you come back. We're going back.
I know, absolutely. Yeah. I showed this work to some curators in Canada and they were all like, well, we don't have lactation rooms here because of our parent leave policy, you know, but they were like, but wow, you really get a sense of what people think about women through these pictures. That's insane. You know? Yeah, I know. The only high income country in the world that doesn't have paid family leave. It is just, and like, of course they could find the money, please. Thank you.
I'm curious about how in the still work there's not like, you know, portraits, women are not pictured, and then in the video work it felt almost like very surprising to me to like see people and hear their voices in a conversational way, not like, you know, an oral storytelling.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about like if that felt like a big leap for you when you were making the video work, or
Yeah.
like why you chose to include.
Yeah. Well, good question. But first of all, like there are people, but at the same time, it's shot in a very anonymous way, partly to like, it's called Milk Factory. That is actually the nickname for the lactation room on Capitol Hill. That's how the whole project title came about. So there is something about this anonymous worker and this idea of the way it's photographed where there is this like secrecy around seeing the women and not really seeing them. And that's partly just because of how, you know, all this, you know, stuff about women healthcare is like shrouded in secrecy. And also this, again, the factory. But in terms of the film, so I didn't show you like one of my most dear to me projects, Bedside Manor, because as you can see, there's a lot of background, and I just felt like it was too much, so I scaled down. But anyway, I'm sort of sad not to share it with you, but it's an 18-minute film, and there are really people in that film. It's about standardized patients or medical actors and medical simulations. So you can't see it online, but if you email me, I'll send you a Vimeo password to see it. So that film, it's not at all like a traditional documentary. It's really like this, again, entering a world, having an experience. But I did show at a lot of medical schools around the country, and it was also played the film festival circuit. And I just realized that, because I am interested in the actual content of the work, and the book does that, but film like really does that. And so I think there was always this question of how to bring the voice of my subject, which is so important, into the work without necessarily showing them. And I realized how powerful film is, especially if you really want to engage in a dialogue, in a conversation with an audience. So that for me was like the turning point in terms of really bringing people into the work. I did a previous film in Germany about a woman who's in love. It's something called objectophilia, where people are sexually and emotionally attracted to objects. So I made a film when I was a resident in Germany about a young girl. Well, she's like 20, I think, and she's in love with the Berlin Hauptbahnhof train station. So it's kind of like a love letter to this building. And it's like shot in this way where there is something soothing about this space and the movement, but then there's also these shots from outside looking at it. So again, that subject is anonymous in that film, but she has like a very strong voice and story to tell. Yeah.
I just want to say that the picture at John Jay is like really special. Like, although it's just like, for me, because like when I went there, I'm an alumna.
Oh, great.
So I went when like I have my daughter. So it was like the weirdest experience, like being pregnant in school. But then I had to remember, like, you're grown and you're married, relax. Like,
yeah.
So it's just really interesting because the daycare there was like.
Went there. I would take her from Williamsburg, drop her off when I went to teach, and some of my students were dropping off their kids too.
Yeah,
great daycare.
And what is
great
the
daycare.
adjunct professor? Like, what does that mean?
It just means I'm not full time, so I don't get paid as much, but I am the highest up adjunct you can be. And I love teaching it. And I love teaching it in the CUNY system. And I love John Jay College. I teach photography, and I've also taught graphic design as well. Yeah. No, I showed my forensic work there, and that's kind of how I got involved in the school. And yes, I love John Jay.
And I absolutely love the miniature dollhouses in the beginning.
Oh, thank you.
It was like something. And then her story about like not getting started until she was like in her 60s.
I know.
It was really inspiring.
It is, right? And then how she advances in this like male-dominated field by co-opting this very feminine tradition of dollhouse making, and sort of subverting that.
Do people still do that today?
I mean, I think you would use like, virtual reality to create spaces. That would be yeah. Yeah, and I have in the back my 2 books. For the 20th anniversary of the Nutshell Studies, Monticelli Press brought back the murder end papers and replaced some of the files because it went from like 20 years ago, it was like darkroom prints. And then it was plates, and then went from plates to digital. So it was sort of once removed quality wise. So I got them to replace a bunch of them with scans. So anyhow, and there's a record of ghost stories. If anyone's interested. But thank you so much. You guys have been a great audience. Thank you.